Hello, personal finance, my old friend. I've come to talk about you again. Because an income regularly saving will grow into a large nest thing. And the independence that was planted in my brain will remain within the sound of personal finance. I'm probably going to regret those pitches. Weird lighting today, right? Weird lighting today. I can pop up the computer and you'll get my glorious blue tinted face. That's so good. Wow, I look kind of like a demon. Alright, good. Let's get to today's topic. First, I'm going to review, broadly, everything I've talked about in these videos. That'll give some context for today. And then we're going to jump into getting started. So the first things most people need to do, I'm going to cover a couple points of psychology that are going to help you to get started, help you think about getting started, how that process works. And then at the very end of it, I'm just going to cover the first three steps in detail. Hopefully I can belt that out pretty quickly. Okie doke. So I've outlined how most people don't have enough to retire because they didn't build enough net worth. A person needs 25 times their annual spending to retire. And a person can build that over 30 years by saving 28% of take-home pay. And if you want to go shorter, 16, 17 years, you can save 50% of take-home pay, but obviously that requires a lot of sacrifices. If you earn $60,000 annually, that means you need to save about $1,000 a month in Silicon Valley. It means that you're going to live in really modest housing until you can get your income above $60,000, which you can do by leveling up job skills in the tech industry, and it should take 1 or 2 years. Even if you make $250,000 together as a couple, the typical $1 million Silicon Valley home is still going to destroy your long-term retirement plans. So even with higher incomes, if you want to stay in Silicon Valley, you still need modest housing. If you have consumer debt, we set aside $1,000 cash, and then we completely pay off the consumer debt using any savings, anything that we can sell, any savings outside of retirement. Then we close all those accounts. We don't ever open any other consumer credit account again. And then we are completely debt-free. We add to that $1,000 emergency fund until we have 3 to 6 months of expenses, and that is our normal emergency fund. I gotta say, if you spend that $1,000 emergency fund down to $500, you pause on the debt payoff while you bring that $1,000 fund back while you bring that $500 back up to a $1,000 fund. It's very important to have a baseline of emergency cash around because things get crazy when you're trying to pay these debt payments, living paycheck to paycheck, and then because if you don't have $1,000 set aside, you're reactive and everything is a crisis. And when everything's a crisis, it makes it difficult to plan, and it's just really distracting. It's hard to stay focused. So that $1,000 is really important. Okie doke. Along the way, through this plan of $1,000 paying off all the debt and then saving 3 to 6 months of expenses, you will need to do some emotional work to keep yourself motivated. Part of that emotional work is definitely going to be a little bit of charitable giving, some volunteering. That's going to help you keep money in its proper context as you surround yourself with kind of learning tools around money, around this process, and around what you want in your life. In the tech industry, if we're talking about that, there are some opportunities for significant windfalls if you get equity at the right company at the right time. However, even if you get 500,000 in equity, 800,000 in equity, $1 million, that you can turn into cash, you still may not want to buy a home because once you have that kind of money, You can put it into index funds, and you can use the cash flows that they generate to give you the freedom to start your own business and build that over time. And I discussed a little bit that, when you're building a business, in the beginning you don't see much return, but after it hits an inflection point and you've got a certain amount of momentum, then you can earn 10 times what you could at a salaried job. So it's worth paying attention to. All right. So this video, I wanted it to be a talk about the very beginning of this. How do you get started with it, and what should you expect? So first thing is finding your personal long-term goals, and then we want to spend time thinking about them and thinking about the changes that we're going to need to make them, changes that we're going to need to make to achieve them. I'm already tired today. And then we're going to need to surround ourselves with things that support us making a change, because changing is hard. Changing habits around money, habits around behavior that account for 80 to 90% of what we do, that's hard. Particularly around habits, the book The Power of Habit talks about what causes people to make big changes, big habit-related changes in their life, and they say it's usually a traumatic event or some kind of group. So like a running group. I know Dave Ramsey has his Financial Peace University classes. Many times a church, which is another group of people, will run one of these classes and help people get through the material. Traumatic event. We don't want those, but death of a parent, heart attack, those often make people make changes, and they have an impact. Obviously, I don't want to lead anybody here towards a traumatic event. It's not a fast process. I think The Power of Habit said 66 days was the average to change this habit around drinking water, drinking a glass of water every morning, something like that. For me, it took several years before I had built up kind of an urgency to change my finances. I wrote an article about it. It's not public, but I actually found the emails that were sent to me and dated the conversations I had that together eventually formed a tidal wave that just pushed me over the edge to doing it. But it wasn't like, a sudden epiphany. It was more like 2 years of constant pressure. And then after that, I found that to the extent that I create, pressure on myself by reading certain things or by talking to different people, then I change even faster. So we're very interested in getting to this change point because it makes it a lot easier to get the technical steps done that we need to do. And I'm going to talk about kind of why that is, why the convincing and goal formation, why that matters so much. I think it's like 40% of the people, or a third of the people who start Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University don't save $1,000. They can't save $1,000 because to do that they have to change these habits, these spending habits that they have, and it's so difficult that they don't manage to do it. So the very first step, it's also the step with the highest failure rate, and we don't want to fail in that step. So to avoid failing, because we know that that's a difficult step, we're gonna work on some brainwashing up front. We're gonna work on some self-convincing up front, and the way we're gonna do that is we're going to study how we make decisions, so that we can know kind of like, okay, I don't believe this, but I probably need to believe it. So how am I gonna make that work? Additionally, we're going to surround ourselves with just influencers. Hope I'm an influencer. Who are moving the direction we want to go in. So, Dave Ramsey's podcast, Mr. Money Mustache's hilarious articles. There's a bunch of YouTubers. There are a bunch of good Facebook groups. I just want you to move in the direction of saving, investing, caring about net worth. I care about that more than anything else. That's why it doesn't bother me to mention other financial blogger people, even if I disagree with them. We're all basically saying, save more money. Oh, I need to break out that music video. It's really good about saving money. So, in my view, I really don't care what pushes you over the edge. I really don't care if it's something I think is dumb or something that I think is way more important or noble than any goal that I have. I just care that you do. So that's what I'm moving in the direction of. It's definitely going to take time. I said that already. Ugh, okay. And, when I've thought about doing this, I know that I'm going to have to say the same stuff over and over again. I know that I can't just film like 10 perfect information videos this year and consider myself a success, because people need reinforcement constantly while they're doing this. So I need to make, 300 videos about the same thing that are slightly different so that you'll watch them every day, but you're basically getting the same message: build net worth, save money, plan your budget. And that, if someone is listening to you right now and they think I'm stupid, which I am, admittedly, but that's fine. Just keep watching me. And in 2 years, if you wake up one morning and that switch is flipped, then I'm totally fine with that. That's great, because the switch did flip. That's a success. The problem is, in any of these programs, is try to do it, quit. Try to diet, quit. Try to exercise, quit. It's the complete disconnection that kills us. So we have to stay connected with content that's around our goals constantly, even if I'm not practicing to be an Olympic rower right now. I guess if I was going to be an Olympic rower, I'd probably want to subscribe to some rowing channels on YouTube, even if it's going to be a couple of years before I grow up and I can be, Winklevoss brother. Okay. So, another thing to keep in mind, because I say, listen to you every day for 2 years, Lewis. My God, I'd go insane. Maybe. But you're already listening to people all the time who are telling you what to do. They're called advertisers. They drive a tremendous amount of decision-making and spending. We're going to talk about kind of how much effort advertisers put into it and how they operate, because when you actually notice how things are working, then you're able to resist that messaging a little bit more. But that's not what we're doing today. Today we're going to talk about cognitive biases around decision-making. And, there's a little bit of armchair psychology first, is I've found that decisions tend to be self-reinforcing. And what that means is that when you make a big important decision in your life, you kind of build up evidence, build up emotion, build up frustration, and then you hit this inflection point and you move to this other side where now you've decided you need to make a change. And after you move across that inflection point to whatever the new side is, the way that you view reality is going to tend to reinforce. Your brain is going to want reality to move itself away from the inflection point. Now, equivalently, in the beginning, there are things pushing you away from making a change in your life. There's a lot of excuses that we make to kind of push ourselves away from making the changes that we need to make. But, when the sky is falling and things are really messing up with money and you don't know how you're going to afford the backyard and you really want a dog, you're eventually going to reach that inflection point. And then your brain is going to really want to believe it. So it's really important to try and get ourselves beyond that inflection point. Once with money, that you do kind of really embrace that net worth building is so important, that it's more important than spending on a cruise. It's more important than living in a house. It's more important than, owning a nice car. Then these technical things become so much easier. Emotionally, once you get yourself past that hill, these things aren't nearly as painful. And that's the reason why I'm talking about this emotional stuff, because technically speaking, these are easy to understand. emotionally they're really hard to do if you don't already believe in how important they are. So we're working on making this stuff important to ourselves. I'm linking here to a list of cognitive biases. The behavioral economist Dan Ariely has done a bunch of interesting work on that. Great book called Predictably Irrational, which I think everybody should read. Also, it's the Kahneman book, Kahneman and Tversky, that I mentioned before, called Thinking Fast and Slow. That also talks about a bunch of cognitive biases. And so I encourage people in their free time to go look up those, read about those, think about how your decision making might be influenced by some of these. But the two that I want to point out right now are choice supportive bias and confirmation bias. So I'm just going to read those out in cognitive science. Choice supportive bias, or post-purchase rationalization, is the tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an option one has selected. As a person ages, this is interesting, I think. As a person ages, regulating personal emotion becomes a higher priority, whereas knowledge acquisition becomes less of a powerful motive. Therefore, choice supportive bias would arise because their focus was on how they felt about the choice rather than on the factual details of the options. Studies have shown that when younger adults are encouraged to remember the emotional aspect of a choice, they are more likely to show choice supportive bias. So this cuts both ways. You know, on the side of like a spending decision, even if it was a really bad spending decision, we don't want to believe it's bad. So our brains are going to want to tend to push us in the direction of justifying it. Now on the savings side, it can work the same way, except it's a little bit different in the sense that, you know, if you save money, of course you'd be like, yeah, it was very responsible for me to save money. A difference between spending and saving is that if you spend the money and you regret it, you typically don't get to reverse that expenditure. Especially on, you know, you can't take a car out of a car lot and then return it 3 days later and get all your money back. It doesn't work that way. But savings, an investment, the great thing is most of the time when you save and invest money, the money's still there. If you wanted to have the money again, instead of having the money be productively invested, you can just pull it out. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's kind of a nice difference there. The next bias is confirmation bias, also called confirmatory bias or my side bias. I've never heard of my side bias. I wonder if it's like on mysidebias.com. That'd be a fun website. It is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. So both of these biases tend to try to keep us at the status quo. And we're looking to change here. We're looking to do better in our money choices, not just keep the same beliefs that we already have about them. So we want to be very careful as we read through different types of articles, as we listen to new financial information, as we see new financial models. We want to be very careful to ask ourselves when we see these things, am I so enthusiastic about this savings article just because it's confirmation bias? Or, you know, am I really digging into the technical details of this article to see if the author was rigorous in their research? And similarly, with the decisions that we make, we should always do yearly reviews, do monthly reviews, and even look back at things that we remember as being a good idea, and just take a second look. Just take a second look and see what you think later. And that's going to help you make better decisions in the long run, see what other purchases you could have made instead of, even if you enjoy the purchase, what other purchases could you have made instead? You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but just having that in our minds helps us. All right. The final psychology thing I want to talk about today is a concept called scripts. So I got this idea in my head from a book called The Games That We Play. It's like this kind of armchair psychology book from the 70s. that kind of describes these unhealthy interactions, repeating interactions between people. And this guy forms this complicated hierarchy around basically these repeating patterns. So today I was in a bookstore, and I found this book. I found Games. Let's see if I can get this to show up. Yeah, Games Alcoholics Play. Parcheesi, beer pong. And I didn't realize it actually until I had it out of the store that this is actually kind of just a subset of the Games We Play book that I looked at before from the 70s. And it discusses kind of a bunch of psychology mumbo jumbo. See, there's a section that says scripts. Yeah. But there are some very specific parts of the book, and I need to read them more in detail, where they and I got this because I'm interested in the addiction kind of area of my cubic, that very lowest addiction level. I was hoping that maybe this book could help me recognize some things when I talk to people who have certain issues, and then recognize from the conversation, like, this person's likely an alcoholic, but they don't realize it yet. Anyhow, point is, this concept of scripts where we have an internal narrative about why our life is the way it is, about why we make certain decisions, about things that happened to us in the past, and so now we always make decisions in a certain way. And if we really think through everything from beginning to end, I think there are very few people who have completely coherent narratives and a completely coherent and integrated and consistent set of ways that they make decisions. I think people have people run one part of their life this way, and another part of their life this way, and even another part of their life this way, and at the borders, at the seams of those different parts of life, they don't always connect. So someone can be very good in one area, such as like relationships, but then the consistency that helps them to be good in relationships doesn't translate over to their money situation. So part of I guess just improving as a person, but also changing as a person and changing in positive ways in the money space, is going to be to understand what scripts, what stories do you have for yourself around money, and where did they come from, and do they withstand scrutiny? Do they really make sense? If you substituted in a different story, would it matter? Would your life be better? What can we do there? So I've written a few down here. If you think, some people will just think they're going to be rich someday, so it really doesn't matter if I blow the money now. I'll have plenty later. That's one kind of script. But there's another, there's different scripts. There's scripts like, I feel so lucky about the opportunities I've had, so I need to conserve resources so that I have more in the future to pay it forward. That's another kind of script a person can have. They have different results in the long run. A very common script for people from poor backgrounds is that there's no point saving because something will always come up and there will never be enough money, so you might as well spend it while you have it. There's a similar script from people who have had really life or death, very scary, post-traumatic stress disorder things in the past that's like, well, I don't even know if there's going to be a tomorrow, so there's no point saving. And for these scripts, we need to explicitly recognize what are the things that we repeat to ourselves over and over again throughout the years to explain why we're making certain decisions. And do we have alternatives that we could put in there? And would it help us to put some alternatives in there? So I think it's a good, I don't know, half an hour exercise to just ask yourself that. Write out some sentences about different things in your life that strongly influence how you spend money, how much debt you have, how much income you have. And then, just force yourself to list out possibilities. And that's oftentimes the hardest thing, is to list out alternatives, even in situations where you don't need to. I find I do that a lot relationally when I'm trying to think through why a person does something some way. My gut instinct is usually to be very suspicious of them, and then I force myself to list out 2 non-suspicious, innocent alternatives, just to make sure I'm not crazy. And that helps me to be less crazy. Free non-crazy tip, kids. Studies have shown that kids who think they can improve at math tend to improve at math more. And so when we analyze our stories around money, we would like to switch to stories that have a lot of possibility, because those those stories that allow us room to seriously change our life, they actually increase our chances of success. But again, look, it took me several years to get over this, so I don't expect you to do one of these, script writing exercises in half an hour, and then after the half an hour is done, you desperately want to save $1,000. I just expect this is one of like a dozen things you're going to do that eventually mangle your brain enough that you're convinced that savings and net worth building is a big priority, the most important thing in your financial life. So again, repeating these steps. We want to save $1,000. That's going to let us avoid the really stupid money mistakes: payday loans, overdraft fees, flat tires. Who knew that anybody ever got a flat tire? And if we're starting on a aggressive savings plan or aggressive debt payoff plan, you're going to make mistakes in your budget. Your budget's immature. It needs time to grow up. And so we need this $1,000 because the budget's going to barf on the floor and someone's going to have to clean it up. And we know that. Not everybody is going to be like an amazing budgeter. I think, if you actually listed out line items on my budget, my guess is that half of them came to me as like annual surprises. Because in the beginning, I'm sure I just did like a monthly thing, and I'm like, what? There's a 6-month car insurance payment? Where'd that come from? Oh, I have a car. Yeah. Okay, so after we save $1,000, we pay off all the consumer debt, all of it, kill it. We need that cash flow, and we also want to force ourselves to design our lives around building net worth rather than taking out debt. So credit cards, personal loans, car loans, student loans, old loans, business loans, all the little loans. We list out the balances from smallest to largest. This is the debt snowball method. We pay the minimums on everything and use every extra dollar we can squeeze out of the budget to pay off the smallest loan. Once that loan is paid off, it's going to free up even more incoming cash flow, and we can roll that into paying off the next largest debt. And we do that until we have all the debt paid off. In 2 years in Silicon Valley, you should be able to pay off about $40,000 of debt. And I think that's part of a model that starts at a $60,000 income and after a year bumps itself up to an $80,000 income. And finally, once all that consumer debt is gone, and we want to save 3 to 6 months of emergency expenses, 3 to 6 months of your spending in an emergency fund. You need to do this before you buy a house. You need to do this before you invest in retirement. You need to do this as soon as you're out of debt, because this money protects your investments and life happens. And remember, we really never want to be in that kind of panic, paycheck to paycheck, freak out all the time mode, because it's just too distracting, and it really harms us emotionally in terms of staying involved with an orderly plan. If you're self-employed, you may want more than 3 to 6 months, because a lot of times with the self-employment, there are much larger income swings than if you're on a reliable salary. So to encourage yourself to get an emergency fund, we have another exercise. This one up here, this is going to be listing out the scripts that you tell yourself. This one is just going to be list out all the horrible things that could happen that's going to cause you some money problems. Health problems, pet health problems, car problems, catastrophes, apocalypses, job losses, accidents, anything that could throw you off, possibly listed here. And an apocalypse doesn't happen every 10 years, but usually a job loss does, especially for millennials. The lower your expenses, the lower this 3 to 6 month emergency fund needs to be, which means it's easier to rebuild, and it's basically a larger fraction of your net worth also gets to be invested in longer term, more profitable investments if you have a smaller emergency fund. So that is a good reason to cut back on that spending. The emergency fund needs to be liquid enough to pay for an emergency, but inconvenient enough that you don't use it for stupid things. So maybe you have a checkbook associated with your emergency fund, but not a debit card. Who knows? And of course, just like that original $1,000 emergency fund, if your 3 to 6 month emergency fund gets a few months knocked off of it because something happens, then it becomes your financial top priority to build back that financial wall instead of putting money towards retirement or anything else. You need to build back the emergency fund. It's the most important thing. All right, and finally, if there is any expense that can be anticipated, it needs to be planned for in the budget and saved for. It's not an emergency if you can predict it. Christmas is not an emergency. New car tires, unless they randomly blow out, they're not an emergency. It's something where you can look up how long does car tire last, and then put a reminder to yourself in the future that you're going to need to come up with $600, $800, whatever it is for new car tires. Okie doke. All right, we are done with today. I need to get in bed. Got a really early flight tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about scripts as they apply to financial thoughts and cognitive biases as they apply to decision making. Have a wonderful night.